Okay, with no more ado, I'll turn to our speaker. It gives me tremendous pleasure to welcome Professor Nazila Ghanea, who is Professor of International Human Rights Law here at Oxford, where she directs the MSc in International Human Rights Law. Nazila was based here in the Department for Continuing Education for a number of years, from 2007 to 2022, during which time for me and for the rest of us, she was the most excellent colleague, and it's fantastic to have her back here in the building. Since then, she's been based in the law faculty. She also serves as Associate Director of the Oxford Human Rights Hub and is also a Fellow of Kellogg College. Her research spans freedom of religion and belief, freedom of expression, women's rights, minority rights, and human rights in the Middle East. She's very widely published, not least co-authorship of a major work, Freedom of Religion or Belief, an International Law Commentary, published by OUP in 2016. She's been awarded many prizes and distinctions during her career, and since August of 2022, she served as UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief, an appointment made by the UN Human Rights Council, and which I'm informed runs for 6 years in all. So really grateful that Naz is able to join us today for this lecture, and I'm looking forward to it very much.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be back in the department, which was my home for 15 years, and it's the most wonderful collegial department that you can imagine. Thank you, David, for chasing me so many times, and Amy for your support. It's a real pleasure to address this topic, and thank you, colleagues and friends. I wanted to address what it's like to try and navigate this mandate that I've been serving in for about 20 months now, and I wanted to also garner your views on how you would navigate it. I think the youngest person who's been coerced to come to this lecture is not entirely happy about it, but I do thank his father for helping me with these slides, Dr. Alves Pinto. So what are the special rapporteurs, and what is even the UN Human Rights Council that makes this appointment? I will spend a bit of time giving background before sharing the dilemma with you and inviting your views on it. So the UN Charter was obviously the founding document for the United Nations. And it was in 1945, the UN Charter was adopted. And one of the elements that will shape and have an impact on our discussion is the fact that the United Nations Charter outlines that there can't be, first of all, the United Nations should not intervene in matters which are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of any state. The principle of non-interference shapes this intergovernmental body, and it is an intergovernmental body. We see left, right, and center criticism and higher expectations of the United Nations, quicker action, stronger action, and those are all legitimate. But the fact that it is composed of governments, it's a state-centric body, informs many of the limitations on it, but also the opportunities that it has. But have in mind non-interference when we also are discussing the work of independent human rights experts. Initially, even, the UN was quite clear that its Commission on Human Rights, so the authority, the highest authority it had to carry forward its commitment to human rights work, had no power to take any action in regard to any complaints concerning human rights. So this was sort of shocking to think that some 75 years ago, that was quite clear to them, that they would not only not interfere in what should be the business of a sovereign state and in its own jurisdiction, but that even the body committed to human rights would have no such power. So let's have that in mind in trying to clutch at positives and how things have moved, albeit very slowly. Despite those limitations and sort of quite clear perspectives on how things might be in 1945, the UN Charter did have human rights as one of its purposes, one of the purposes for the creation of this new international organization. So there you see it in Article 1, along with international peace and security. So to develop friendly relations among states, to respect the principle of equal rights. And then the third element, it talks about to achieve international cooperation. And in relation to that, it would promote and encourage respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms for all without distinction. And when it comes to the mandate on freedom of religion or belief, both of these matter. So we have both the freedom of religion or belief for everyone, and secondly, in relation to all human rights, there should be no discrimination on the basis of somebody's religion, their non-religion, their belief, okay? And both of those play out. So it's a founding objective of the United Nations, yet there was also this understanding that there wouldn't be any interference. So how did that get figured out over the recent decades? The first standard, the first instrument upholding human rights was, of course, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. If you go to the Bonavero Institute in Mansfield College, you will also see a statue that commemorates and marks Eleanor Roosevelt, who was the founding chair of the UN Commission on Human Rights, and under whose chairpersonship the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was drafted and adopted. So UN is formed in 1945. In 1946, the United Nations, with respect to one of its founding objectives to promote and protect human rights, creates a new body called the Commission on Human Rights. And the first task before the Commission is to draft and then adopt the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is adopted 10th of December, 1948. From 1946 until 2006, the key intergovernmental body taking forward that founding objective of promoting and encouraging human rights for all, for everyone on an equal basis without discrimination is taken forward by the Commission on Human Rights, but since 2007, we have a new intergovernmental body called the UN Human Rights Council. About a quarter of the member states of the United Nations, that's 193 member states, 2 observer states, a quarter of them are members of the UN Human Rights Council at any one time. And this is what it looks like. So the UN Human Rights Council is a subsidiary body to the United Nations General Assembly. Okay? It is served, its secretariat is the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and that's all you need to know. But I'm trying to situate it all before we move on to the experts. I also want to note that the budget of the United Nations is very small, considering how many entities, how many agencies at international level, national level, and local level, in capitals, in development, in work around the world, in health work, in emergency work, etc., etc. Considering the amount of work that it does around the world, the budget is really quite small. And of that budget, 3.7% goes to human rights. So one may have expected a more generous allocation to human rights, considering it was one of the founding objectives of the whole organization, but that is where things stand. Now, special procedures don't draw on that budget because mandate holders are unpaid. So considering the theme of freedom of religion or belief, a vow of poverty is not unusual in this arena, and it holds for the mandate as well. But the person who supports you in Geneva, which should be 1.5 persons, but sometimes it's less, that person is a UN human rights officer. Okay, so mandate holders are appointed by the United Nations Human Rights Council, so the main intergovernmental body focused on human rights. and they are independent experts based around the world, doing their normal jobs. And I should thank University of Oxford, Kellogg College, and all other entities for really allowing me the time to dedicate to this. So that's how it is with all mandate holders, unless they're people of substantial means or retired. The experts are independent, so you are not a staff member, obviously, of the United Nations. And that independence is not only financially beneficial, but it's also to ensure the impartiality and independence of an expert coming in to serve a particular arena of human rights and giving its, its work, its recommendations, its assessments, its reporting, etc., to the United Nations as a whole. The idea is that by having independent experts, it can be flexible, it can be responsive, and it can offer expertise to the United Nations Human Rights Council. But how did this idea of special rapporteurs, special procedures even emerge in the United Nations? Certainly we saw that it was not foreseeable in the 40s, because there was this very rigid understanding of non-interference and not commenting on human rights, which were seen really as a precious preserve of each state. I think there are many states today that still think it is the precious preserve of their, their jurisdiction, their business. But in the past 75 years, our understanding in general has grown to say that that is not interference, that is assistance to a state to facilitate it and support it in meeting its legal obligations. So they did emerge really over time, and not quite by accident, but through practice. And we can thank South Africa for sort of lending impetus initially to that, and later to Chile. So in 1965, the Commission on Human Rights is getting more and more petitions from South Africa and comes under a lot of pressure to deal with them. Now, the Commission is meeting each spring in Geneva for about 6 weeks. Who are the members of the Commission on Human Rights, which is now the Human Rights Council? States, right? At that time, there were 53 member states making the decisions, drafting the resolutions, adopting them, making the decisions, right? So these, the delegations are going to Geneva, they're meeting for 6 weeks, and they are receiving more and more petitions. So how is this state entity that is meeting for 6 weeks a year to respond to this? Really just because of the pressure on them. And you will also know from history that there was also a lot of international pressure and support to address apartheid, that the Commission just innovates and appoints a working group to investigate the situation of human rights in South Africa. So at that time, I'm sure it thought it was a one-off and it was unique, and that would be the end of that. So in 1967, the first special procedure is born through that demand. Similarly, some years later in 1973, in Chile, we know about the disappearances and the political turmoil the country is under, the huge human rights violations that are being experienced. And the Commission in 1975 appoints a working group to inquire into the situation of human rights. You'll see that the early working groups and these inquiries were actually delegations. So, members of delegations of the Commission on Human Rights were being appointed to carry this out. But over time, more and more non-diplomats and independent experts are being drawn in to do this. The Chilean inquiry, some years later, 6 years later, is replaced by two different entities. One, to look at the fate of the disappeared in Chile. So one is very specific. And the second is a thematic and global special procedure appointment, which is a working group on disappearances, which is now dealing with the question of enforced disappearances, not only in Chile, but around the world. So this duality, this sort of double track of country focus and thematic focus informs everything that has happened since. There are mandates that are tasked with looking at human rights in a particular country, and the vast majority of mandates, however, are focused on a thematic area of human rights with a global mandate. So in 1990, there were 6 mandates, okay? And one of them is freedom of religion or belief. At that time, the name of the mandate was religious intolerance. Why was it one of the early mandates? Well, that has a backstory as well. And it's because the General Assembly decides in the early 60s to task the drafting of an instrument to address racial and religious intolerance. After a couple of years of effort, they realized that the religious intolerance element is what is holding them back. So they drop it to return to it later. And they proceed, they quickly draft an international instrument on racial discrimination. It becomes the first United Nations treaty body. They return to the question of religious intolerance and discrimination, and still they struggle. And it's not until 1981, more than 20 years later, that they are able to adopt a declaration. The difference between the treaty, the binding treaty that is adopted already and enforced by 1965 on racial discrimination, and this declaration that is only adopted in 1981 on religious intolerance and discrimination, is that a treaty is legally binding, a declaration is not. So perhaps there was a bit of, they felt a bit of guilt that, you know, they were tasked in the early 1960s to have a treaty on religious intolerance. That is not going to proceed. It's taken 21 years to come to a declaration. So in 1986, it's decided that there should be a mandate. There should be an impartial, independent expert appointed to pursue the objectives, at least, of this declaration. Okay, so not legally binding, but it's one of the very early investigative, impartial mechanisms of the United Nations Commission on Human Rights. The number of mandate holders has grown enormously since the 90s, steadily until the 90s, more and more appointments through the 90s, and there, you know, hardly a year goes by where new mandates are not created by the UN Human Rights Council. Now we have 46 thematic mandates and 14 country mandates. The thematic mandates, such as freedom of religion or belief, they look at a single theme of human rights concern around the world in all 193 states. The country mandate holders look at all human rights, but only within a particular country. So the role, the advantage of a mandate should be that it is agile. It doesn't depend on which binding international treaties the country has ratified. It doesn't depend on whether it is, proactively engaging and working on that thematic area. That the mandate can respond to the concern around the world, even if a state is quite reticent. It makes a difference. I'll explain what difference it makes whether the state doesn't engage, but the mandate holder can still address the human rights concerns in that country. So ratification doesn't matter. It's not like other legal procedures, for example, taking a case to the European Court of Human Rights, where you need to have exhausted all domestic possibilities before you take a case. So it's just a much more flexible tool. And there is the opportunity of, therefore, responding much more quickly. We know that regional cases often take 6-7 years, if not longer. We know that states with the strongest human rights concerns are unlikely to have ratified that particular the treaty that protects that particular right. As an example, I would encourage you to look at the Migrant Workers Treaty and see how few countries have ratified it, and how the countries with most migrants and most human rights concerns regarding migrants have not ratified it, so they're not answerable to that that committee and that legal treaty. Now, the mandates are appointed by the UN Human Rights Council, And they are often described as the frontline troops or the eyes and ears of the Human Rights Council. Why eyes and ears? Because, you know, they're not only discussing human rights in particular sessions, they can work year-round, and they are gathering information, reporting, responding, communicating throughout the year, and also reporting to the UN Human Rights Council and the UN General Assembly itself. We know that the thematic mandates are concerned with all members of the United Nations, and the flexibility, the structure of a mandate means that it is possible to seek to push normative boundaries, to assess, advise, and sometimes criticize the record of states, and to seek to promote and protect human rights. Now, before going further, maybe I should spend a couple of minutes to say, what does freedom of religion or belief mean in human rights? Freedom of religion or belief is upheld in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that was already adopted in 1948. It is in the binding international instruments, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and maybe I'll focus on that for a moment. It's the right of everyone to have, adopt, or change their religion or belief. And in fact, religion or belief is an abbreviation. The actual language is the right of everyone to have thought, conscience, religion of their choice. Okay, so everyone can have, adopt, and change that. And you might think, well, that's very well. Everybody has this internal right to have the thought, conscience, religion, or belief of their choice. But it can also be manifested, not only alone, but with others, not only in private, but also in public. Now, can manifestation of thought, conscience, and religion be unlimited? Well, the Article 18 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, it says that, yes, it can be limited. Indeed, we can think of scenarios where the state should limit manifestation of freedom of religion or belief, primarily, or if I want to summarize it, if it impacts the rights and freedoms of others. Okay? So yes, it's a freedom, but it can't be absolute, because you might assert your freedom of thought, conscience, and religion in a way that limits the rights and freedoms of others, not only their rights to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, but their other human rights. Now, across all instruments, there is also non-discrimination based on religion or belief. So obviously everyone is free, should be free, to enjoy their freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, but also in relation to housing, employment, in relation to movement, in relation to all the human rights you can imagine, and all of them that are protected. There should also be no discrimination. Okay, so it's not only freedom of religion or belief is deeply entangled with also the protection against any kind of discrimination on the basis of anybody's thought, conscience, or religion. So that is the scope of this mandate. What do mandate holders do? I'm interchangeably using the word special rapporteur or special procedures or independent experts, but whatever we call them, what do these mandate holders do? They report, as I suggested, in this mandate. It's one reporting to the United Nations General Assembly and one to the Human Rights Council. What does that look like? It means you choose a thematic area, you produce a report of 10,700 words, not a word more than that, or it will be cut back, and it is translated into the UN languages, and you're able to interact with the UN General Assembly and the Human Rights Council, essentially for an hour, in presenting and receiving comments and then responding again. So October to the United Nations General Assembly, and in March to the UN Human Rights Council. So that's the opportunity to present a thematic area in relation to your human rights mandate, and to be able to present it. You hope they've read it, not always, maybe they've read the summary, but it is then available and you can engage to some extent. That 1 hour is only one opportunity. There are often opportunities to present at seminars, workshops, to civil society, to to other experts and so on. So it's there on record and can be utilized. You hope that you've sort of established an area of human rights concern with your mandate. You can also visit countries. So these are essentially 10, 11-day visits. And those reports too are translated into the UN languages, made available, and you present them to the Human Rights Council. The countries I've visited so far have been Tajikistan and Sweden. I'm happy to discuss, how one might choose, of 193 states. Let me spend a minute on that. Actually, how do I choose it? There's 193 states. There's no shortage of infringements and violations of freedom of thought, conscience, and religion around the world. I always say to every state or that I'm interacting with that it's freedom of religion or belief will never be completed. It will always be a work in progress. There are shortcomings and violations or infringements or restrictions in every country of the world. Okay, so let's just establish that as a baseline. I know that states want to say that they have a perfect record sometimes, but that's my baseline, is that it's not perfect anywhere. If you feel very confident about freedom of thought, conscience, and religion where you live, I guess it's UK, but you may also have lived or, come from other countries. We might think about, for example, the freedom of thought, conscience, and religion of asylum seekers, those who are escaping religious persecution. Are they right? Why are there tens of thousands of people waiting for resettlement around the world? And why are there tens of thousands more that are not able to escape, even though they are facing religious persecution? So that's just one example of how all states are falling short in upholding freedom of religion or belief. But what I've looked at is all the countries that the mandate has visited in the past. I'm mindful of regional balance. And then you're on a bit of a, so what is it? Is it speed dating? I don't know if it's speed dating. But then you ask countries if you can visit. Now, 2/3 of the countries of the world have issued standing invitations. And they've said that any mandate can come at any time. But good luck with that, because when you actually say, I'm very pleased to know that you have a standing invitation to welcome mandate holders, then there is, we only allow one a year, and we've already scheduled one, or this year is an election year, or I will send it to Capital, but a response never comes. So you have to knock on many doors to seek that and then see which ones are coming. So you can't ensure that you go to a different continent every year, or that you can, have this perfect mapping of all the countries ever visited, all the ones that there is ongoing engagement and concerns with, and you have your kind of priority. It doesn't in reality work like that, but at least the effort is made. And then there are communications that mandate holders can engage. What does that mean? It means almost every day you receive reports of incidents. What are incidents? It's a very nice way of saying violations or alleged violations of freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. Now, you can't act on that because actually the Code of Conduct says you can't purely work on media reports. So that's understandable. It needs to be more robust than that. So the person that is reporting an incident, you ask them to fill in some details, which day, what, how, and the consent of the victim or victims, okay? You can't proceed and raise an issue with the country concerned unless those people concerned have agreed for it to be shared, okay? So that's an obvious human rights methodology that must be respected. But so some of these incidents that you receive and go through those loopholes, essentially it's written up along with the legal standards that have been, if it is confirmed that these reports are accurate, then what are the laws and standards that have been violated? And you intervene essentially on behalf of those victims with the country concerned. For 60 days, that communication is confidential, gives a chance for the country to respond, to say we didn't know, or the authority concerned has been asked to answer it, or that we are dealing with it. I mean, you welcome a response from the state concerned, and whether or not they have responded, you make that public. Well, that's a very you know, it's not a very simple process, but what's in it for the victim or victims concerned is that it's then not only their word, but a UN entity, official UN paper has intervened on their behalf, and they would likely use that in their advocacy going forward. In the media, they'll say, well, X number of special rapporteurs intervened, the government did not respond, or it failed to respond, or it went off at a tangent and didn't firmly respond, or if the state concerned is robustly dealing with it, then that's all well and good, isn't it? So these are the communications, but there are also press releases that can be issued. Now, the challenge is that there are more and more special rapporteurs, but there's less and less finance supporting it. Already it was 3.7% for all the human rights work all over the world. And the mandates don't go along with an increase in that percentage of the UN budget. States that have a more positive record are more likely to engage with you, or a less negative record. And those that have the most severe are less likely to allow you on a country visit, for example. Or, you know, there are states that we are sending maybe a dozen allegation letters to per year, because that's just the volume of incidents that are happening. And there's absolutely no response to the allegation letters. Now, I'll go into the code of conduct to explore with you what limitations that puts on the work of the mandate holders. And there's the challenge of follow-up, because there's the volume of work is high. But I don't want to complain. It's also an amazing opportunity to try and serve in an area that, you know, your scholarship, your work, or, you know, you have a commitment to. So it's a wonderful platform to engage people. So I don't want to focus on the realities, but there are some realities that shape the work. If I pass by, what have special rapporteurs done since, you know, 1967, where the first one was created? They've contributed to legislative reform. They've, you know, helped obtain redress. So when you get a response to your allegation letter and where action is taken, prisoners are released, death penalties are commuted, you know, the ban on particular groups is lifted. I mean, you know, one could, I hope somebody produces really a volume of successes of mandate holders. You do see the annual report online, but I haven't seen really somebody gathering it all together in an encyclopedia, but it would be a very impressive record. The standard setting. So many times the special rapporteurs say there's a gap. So Beth, who is here in the audience, helped a former mandate holder regarding the freedom of thought. And, you know, this is like a new frontier in our understanding of freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. And that generates then further scholarship, not least also through Beth herself. And, you know, it can aid protection. It can sort of lift horizons of, you know, limitations and understandings. And therefore, there might be more standard setting in the future in this area, and more, of course, awareness raising. Now, this is what you sign, and I hope some of you will consider putting yourself forward or agreeing to being nominated as a special rapporteur in the future. This is what you would have to sign. Now, it talks about impartiality, being conscientious and loyal, being truthful. And, you know, what the code of conduct says later on in the code of conduct is that there should be no private gain. So, you know, a vow of poverty, absolute vow of poverty. So no direct or indirect benefit from carrying out the mandate, no money in pursuing the objectives of the mandate. Confidentiality of sources, well, that's obvious. I mean, hopefully everybody in human rights arena and beyond respects that. Independent capacity, so you shouldn't be influenced, incited, pressured, threatened, or there shouldn't be interference in your work. You shouldn't accept instructions, whether from governments or other entities. I think these are self-evident, and in the code of conduct, you sign off on that. So that's all well and good. Then I think it comes to another area that should be obvious, that special rapporteurs should be professional, They should be impartial. They should impartially assess the facts based on international human rights standards. Obviously, I mean, it is all shaped and informed by international human rights law and human rights norms. So, and they should evaluate information in light of that and cross-check it to the best extent possible. Okay, again, that is standard human rights professionalism. Then it also says that you should exercise your functions in accordance with your mandate, focused exclusively on the implementation of the mandate, strictly observing the mandate, and ensuring that recommendations do not exceed the mandate. It also says that mandate holders should show restraint, moderation, and discretion so as to not undermine the recognition of the independent nature of their mandate and properly discharge it. Now, this mandate, you know, we know that the first mandate started in 1967. This code of conduct was proposed and adopted only in 2007, so it's fairly recent. Now I get to navigating the tightrope. I said that the first elements of professionalism are shared challenges, and we should take them for granted. We should obviously be mindful of them, but it should be assumed that that would be the case. But how can you be exclusively focused on a mandate where we also know that all human rights are interrelated? So even the code of conduct itself says all human rights are universal, interdependent, indivisible. Okay, so if your mandate is thematic and it's indivisible and interconnected with other areas of human rights, other thematic areas, then how can it be exclusively focused on that? Surely the intersections are where it often gets more interesting and where the work needs to be clarified. We should also show restraint, moderation, and discretion, but you're dealing with, at times, massive human rights violations, and you want them addressed, and you want to remind of the obligations that are being infringed and violated with clarity, right? So how moderate and restrained should you be in order to properly discharge your mandate in protecting human rights? So this is where I want to put the focus, and I'll open the floor in just 1 minute, but to say that previous mandate holders have highlighted two things that are particular to freedom of religion or belief, or I believe maybe are just sort of more pronounced in relation to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. What are those? Is that, well, first of all, the scope of it, it's very easy to say it's the right of everyone, and it's a right of everyone to thought, conscience, and religion that includes non-religion, right? But when you look at particular jurisdictions where there is a restriction of the number of recognized religions, where there is a social hostility or antagonism to particular religions or beliefs, where states themselves are using the language of cult, which immediately suggests a lower protection or a derogatory term for an arena that for the holders is undoubtedly an arena of thought, conscience, and religion. The platform is already problematic in a lot of jurisdictions. So that the scope of the mandate itself doesn't sit well with many realities around the world, to put it very nicely. And then you have the weaponization of religion. You know, everybody, every jurisdiction, every state, every entity seems to know what is good religion and bad religion. What are the parameters of it? What religion should look like? You know, indigenous peoples might look at us and think that how non-indigenous peoples think about thought, conscience, and religion is really strange and unusual. Why is it so narrow? Why might it be focused on particular ceremonies or celebrations? Why is it so discrete? But those who are non-indigenous may look at indigenous spirituality and say, why is it so vast? Why does it permeate land and rivers and ancestors? So, you know, all of us are limited in our imagination as to what religion looks like. And all of us also may be prone to weaponizing that understanding, or religion itself in order to achieve particular objectives. We might be more comfortable with it being instrumentalized in one direction rather than another. And beyond that, we might look at conflict situations and disputes, and where religion is sort of really strongly weaponized by a particular political party, by a particular politician, or outrightly in a war by both sides. So those, I've never obviously been the mandate holder for extrajudicial killings, but one would think that the parameters of what is or isn't an extrajudicial killing, what is or isn't a cultural right, some parameters of some mandate, they have their own complexities. What is violence against women? There are some things that it seems like the parameters might be clearer than this tendency of different entities wanting to religionize different phenomenon around the world to get some gain out of it. So that adds an extra layer of challenge to the moderation, the what did it say? Restraint, moderation, discretion, and robust protection, which is ultimately your role, and the fact of asking you not to go beyond your own mandate. So I want to open the floor and invite your perspectives on how this tightrope is to be balanced. You're trying to keep conversation open with the state. When I send an allegation letter to a state, I want to use a language that is fair to the incidents that have been suffered. Many of them are, really heavy to deal with. And so you don't want to do a disservice to reporting that. But on the other hand, if you use very strong language, then the state isn't going to respond to you. Therefore, you're not helping the person. Now, before on Twitter or social media, I may have been more prone to commenting on issues. And now I'm much more restrained because I think that, my voice is not my own for the next 6 years. And it may be misunderstood and might do a disservice to many victims around the world. So, I'm aware of that restraint. I'm self-restraining myself in order to try and maximize this. But the reality is that the engagement will be shaped by many other factors. Now, if you don't comment on an issue because you want to show restraint and the states want you to have commented on it, of course, they won't point to the article in the Code of Conduct that talks about discretion and restraint. They'll say, oh, this thing is happening. How can you have not commented on it? And you think, well, if it's not my country mandate, and if I want to be careful about not weaponizing religion or religionizing everything in the world, then I have thought I am showing discretion and restraint. So it is a no-win situation. It's not a mandate where you're trying to gain friends. But on the other hand, you're not trying to get enemies because that won't help the thematic mandate you've been entrusted with. But I welcome any thoughts and comments, and I think we have a good half an hour for it. So the floor is open.